All right, today we're going to start a new book, Listening to Crickets, a story about Rachel Carson by Candace F. Ransom. Chapter 1, Summer Nights. Rachel stood very still. If she didn't move, not even a finger, she could almost become a part of the field she was standing in. If she was very quiet, the meadow, a busy world of insects and tiny animals working in the grass, would reveal its secrets to her. Maybe a bird would mistake her for a tree and land on her shoulder. Suddenly, Rachel's mother called her for supper. Her mother's voice carried from the house through the apple orchard to the field. Rachel didn't move. Even though she heard her mother calling, she could hear other things too. There was the whisper of the tall grass and knotweed she stood knee-deep in, the twitterings of the sparrows settling down for the evening, the laughing cry of a robin as it flew off a fence post. She could even hear the tiny rustlings of small creatures, field mice and shrews running along tunnels in the grass. Rachel often roamed the woods and fields that surrounded her home. She had plenty of land to explore. In 1900, before Rachel was born, her father had bought 65 acres of land in Springdale, Pennsylvania, 18 miles from Pittsburgh. Robert Warden Carson had hoped to develop the land, but he was too mild-mannered to be a successful businessman. Mr. Carson sold real estate and insurance while waiting for the right time to sell his land. Now, 17 years later, the Carsons still lived in Springdale. Although the Carson property was not a real farm, there were plenty of cows and chickens and pigs for Rachel to observe. Sometimes Rachel rambled the countryside with her friends Irene Mills and Charlotte Fisher, but most of the time Rachel was alone, except for her dog, Candy. Rachel was used to being alone. Her brother Robert was 18 and her sister Marion was even older, 20. They had busy grown-up lives that left little time for a 10-year-old sister tagging along. Supper was a quiet affair that summer. Rachel's brother had gone to Texas to train in the U.S. Army Aviation Service. The United States had been involved in a war since the spring of that year, 1917. News of the fighting in Europe was splashed across the newspaper. Mr. Carson read every evening. Rachel knew her mother didn't want Robert to go overseas to fight against the Germans, but it was also exciting. Rachel listened intently when her mother read Robert's letters out loud. One letter described the bravery of a Canadian pilot who had been shot down by a German pilot and survived. Rachel thought about that Canadian pilot again and again. After supper, Rachel would often curl up with the new issue of St. Nicholas, a popular magazine for children. She turned to the St. Nicholas League section where there were stories and drawings by other children. If the stories were very good, the writer could win a cash prize and an honor badge. Rachel longed to be included in those hallowed pages. She had been writing stories and poems for years. Back in second grade, she'd made a book for her father, illustrated with her drawings of birds and animals. Her father still had it. On these long evenings, Mrs. Carson would go over to the piano and run her fingers lightly over the keyboard. The Carson family usually sang together, but sometimes Mr. Carson would stand alone beside the piano. In his rich bass voice, he would sing the words to Beautiful Ohio and Rocked in the Cradle of the Deep. Rachel loved songs and poems about the sea, even though she'd never glimpsed the ocean. Springdale, Pennsylvania was a long way from the Atlantic shore, but she would see the ocean someday. When the last notes died away, Mrs. Carson would remind Rachel it was time for bed. She made sure her youngest child got plenty of rest. Once in bed, Rachel could hear the faint plink-plink of the piano as her mother resumed her playing. If Rachel did not feel like going to sleep right away, she would lean her arms on the windowsill and breathe in the fragrant night air. Her keen eyes spied bats snatching insects on the wing. Rachel could tell the difference between bats and swallows, the swift birds wheeling in the purple sky above the barn, catching gnats. From the darkness would come the familiar sound of crickets. Rachel listened to the racket, racket, the unseen insects made by scraping their hind legs together. She often fell asleep to the cricket song. The September 1918 issue of St. Nicholas magazine felt heavy in Rachel's hands and crisply new. She held her breath as she opened it to the St. Nicholas League. Would it be there this time? Oh, let it be there. It was! Rachel couldn't believe her eyes, even though the proof was clearly printed in black and white. Her story, A Battle in the Clouds by Rachel L. Carson, age 10, and it had won the silver badge. Rachel hadn't been able to forget the account of the brave Canadian fighter pilot. She had written a story about the pilot and mailed it off to St. Nicholas magazine, and now she was a published author. Rachel knew her mother would be proud. Maria Carson had great respect for the written word. She read aloud to her children nearly every evening, no matter how old they were. Rachel's earliest memories were of listening to her mother read The Last of the Mohicans, or one of Charles Dickinson's books. Rachel had listened with all her heart and soul, letting the rich prose wash over her like ocean waves. Maybe she would write stories too. When she started school, Rachel learned to write, which gave her the tools she needed to put down on paper the stories she made up in her head. Now, with her first success shimmering on the page before her, Rachel was sure she wanted to be a writer. She was even more certain when she received a check for $10 whole later that month. She was a published, paid author. From that moment on, Rachel's pen fairly flew as she scribbled other stories. The war ended on November 11th, 1918, and Robert came home safely. Rachel saw her name in print again. A message to the front was published in the February 1919 issue of St. Nicholas and earned her a gold badge. She became an honor member with a famous sea fight, published in the August 1919 issue. Rachel went on to high school, where she was an excellent student. 2 days after her 18th birthday, Rachel graduated from Parnassus High School. This quiet, determined girl had important plans regarding the rest of her life. She was going to college to study literature. She was going to be a writer. Nothing would make her change her mind. I hope you're enjoying this book, Listening to Crickets. In the next video, we'll read chapter number 2.